Alrighty. We are going to give a few minutes, probably a minute or two, just to get some more people on the call. So just give it a few minutes and then we'll do a brief introduction and then we'll get going on today's monthly session. Everyone who just joined, we're just going to give it another minute or so, probably start at 11:02. Just allow for people to join. Okie dokie. I mean, I think we'll still have like a few more people join, but it looks like we've got quite a few participants. So I just want to kick off and start and say thank you to everybody who is joining this month's monthly partner meeting. We're super excited about the presentation today. Um, and I just wanted to do a brief introduction of our guest speaker today. So please welcome Eric Dunn from the National Housing Law Project. He will be breaking down tenant screening, how it really works, anything from data sources, algorithms, admission policies, and why applicants are getting denied. He'll also highlight key regulations and legal protections that advocates, landlords, and renters should know about and promote um, fair housing and lawful screening practices. So, without further ado, Eric Dunn, please take it away. We're all very excited to have you.
Thanks. So this is going to be kind of an overview of some of the more important issues in rental admission screening. I'll try to go in depth on some of these, but I understand there'll be time for questions at the end. So, um, if there's something that doesn't make sense or you have follow-up questions about, feel free to ask at that time. But it's sort of the general overview. If been a homeowner or you haven't rented, haven't had to apply for new housing in a while. Um, the process is quite a bit different now than even 15 or 20 years ago in most of the country. Nowadays, it's pretty common that landlords are going to use some kind of an electronic, online rental application. There's some that still use paper applications, but more and more you're seeing electronic portals or electronic applications. Um, Rental application fees are more or less ubiquitous. You're going to be paying an application fee to apply. That's just to be considered for the housing. Usually those are charged per adult in the household. So, if you've got, a single person, obviously one fee. If you've got a, married couple, they might be paying two fees. If they've got an adult child, a third fee and so on. Uh, and then usually those fees, or at least some portion of those fees, are used to purchase a tenant screening report from a third party company. So these are usually credit reporting agencies that specialize in background checks. Often they do employment as well as housing, but they're covered by the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Um, so uh, they'll provide that report to the landlord. Uh, it's this is another thing that's changed in maybe the last 10 years. Used to be um, pretty common that the report would just have a bunch of information about the applicant, and the landlord would look through that and decide whether to accept or reject the applicant. Now, basically, the decision will usually be made by the screening company, which will sort of apply the landlord's rental criteria to some type of algorithm, and either generate a score, and you'd have to have a certain score to get in, or sort of a yes or no type recommendation. And if the applicant is denied, then typically they'll just receive a notice informing them that they're denied, and where the screening report came from. Probably not going to provide any information about the reason or reasons for denial. So as I mentioned, uh, this is something that's really changed fairly recently over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Um, Nowadays, the estimates are somewhere between 85 and 90% of landlords that use these background checks. Feel like that's kind of a deceptive way to present this information, because uh, that may be the percentage of landlords, but the big multifamily, corporate property management firms that have hundreds and hundreds of units, at a site, they all use these systems. And so if you actually looked at the number of rental units, it would be well above 99%. So just about anywhere you apply for housing, you're going to be subjected to this process. So why do landlords do screening? Well, I mean, we don't have the ability to step on a scale and, like in Willy Wonka, and have it say whether the person's a good egg or a bad egg. So they try to use sort of proxies, background information with the assumption that, somebody that has negative information from the past may be more likely to turn out a bad tenant, and vice versa. Of course, that's not always accurate, but this is sort of a list of um, my observation, the most common reasons for denial. The issues in the blue box are things where some landlords will deny people for that, and others will not. So if someone has, say, a lot of delinquent debt that's unrelated to rental housing, or maybe they've got a landlord that's giving them a bad reference from past housing. Well, some landlords don't even inquire with past landlords and don't even look at references, or some, they may ask for that information, but they don't really give it a lot of weight. Um, and so it may just be an issue of trying to find another landlord who doesn't screen for that or doesn't hold it against the person quite as much. Whereas the issues in the yellow box, these are things where just about any landlord is going to automatically decline admission for these things. And so realistically, for a lot of people, about the only way to get in is either to somehow get that off the report, or to use sort of some of the more aggressive legal strategies to challenge some of these policies. Um, and sometimes there's just not going to be an answer for that person. It's sort of implicit in the idea of tenant screening that some people are just not going to get housing, which I think raises some additional philosophical problems, but that's maybe a little beyond the scope of today's presentation. So, um, how reliable is this information? Does it actually have value in terms of predicting who's going to be a good tenant and who's not? The evidence really does not suggest that this information is of very much value, if any. There have been a couple of studies into the predictive value of criminal history, for example. The kind of more well-regarded, more well-known study looked at 15 categories of criminal history. They found that there's absolutely no correlation between having that particular type of criminal record and having a negative housing outcome for 11 out of those 15 categories. Now, a negative housing outcome means that somebody winds up defaulting on the rent, or moving out owing money, or breaking the lease early, or something like that. It doesn't actually mean that they engaged in any kind of criminal activity, or that they actually repeated what, if they had a conviction for a certain type of crime, that they did that sort of crime, or any crime again. It just means that the tenancy didn't work out ideally. And then, of course, even in the four remaining categories, which are property offenses, major drug offenses, fraud, and assault, the study found a very minimal impact in terms of the actual increased risk that that person would have a negative outcome. Um, and then, of course, we don't actually see landlords limiting their screening to just those four categories. So, to the extent that there's evidence suggesting that this information is predictive, landlords don't actually use it in that way. So, I think a lot of this is just sort of seat of the pants type reasoning that, well, if somebody did, some, terrible sounding crime, I don't want that person around. But the evidence doesn't necessarily support that that person's any more likely to do a crime than someone else, or that even in most cases that they're likely to have a negative housing outcome. So, what about eviction records? Well, there haven't really been any studies into any real well conducted studies into the predictive value of eviction records at all. There was one done by tenant screening company, TransUnion. So of course they kind of have maybe a conflict of interest in terms of wanting to show that their product is valuable and that landlords should buy it. But even putting that aside, if you look at how they conducted the study, it wasn't even really a study. It was more of just like a statistical analysis of tenants who had moved out of 200 properties or nearly 200 properties. And they compared people who moved out, people who were evicted and people who were not evicted, and then looked at whether the people who were evicted had previously been evicted somewhere else. And they found that of the people that were evicted from these 200 properties, it was about the percentage of those tenants who had previous eviction records was about 4 times higher. And so, that could be some evidence that if you have a past eviction record, that you're more likely to be evicted again, which is how they presented it. But there's, I think, if you look at this more closely, a pretty obvious flaw, at least obvious to people like me that work on these issues, which is that most evictions are based on non-payment of rent. This is one data point from an industry source where they had found about 77% of evictions were based specifically on non-payment of rent. There's also additional evictions that happen for, say, no cause, but the underlying cause is maybe this person fell behind on rent 2 or 3 times in the preceding year. So the landlord is evicting them. Like their motivation is that the person hasn't paid rent consistently on time, even though technically it's not a non-payment eviction. So there's some uncertainty around the actual percentage, and of course this is just one sample. But it's the large majority of evictions are for non-payment of rent. And that's usually a financial problem. If you look at the amount of money that somebody needs to earn to just afford a modest apartment in the U.S., I mean, it's north of $28 an hour for a one-bedroom apartment, and for a two-bedroom apartment, over $33 an hour. These are wages that the majority of the wage-earning population don't make. And so what that means is that some percentage of tenants are going to be rent burdened, meaning that they're going to be paying more than the recommended 30% of their incomes just toward their housing costs, which also includes things like utilities. So when people have rent burden, then they're more vulnerable to facing eviction if they have an income disruption, if they have some kind of unanticipated expense. And so I think it's fair to say, and I think this is pretty well pretty non-controversial, that eviction records, what they generally reflect is financial insecurity, that people don't have enough money to afford their housing and still have money left over to save and be prepared if there's some kind of rainy day. And so if you really wanted to study whether having an eviction record is predictive of whether somebody's going to default on a lease, what you need to do is you need to control for whether they have the present ability to pay. Because if one person moves into housing and they have the ability to pay, and another person is rent burdened, meaning they're just scraping by, they can afford this but they don't have anything left over for unanticipated expenses, or maybe they're not even meeting all their other needs. Well, then of course that second person is more likely to be evicted than the first. And so to have a proper study, what you would need to do is say, okay, if we've got maybe a household, they may have been evicted in the past, but now the person's got a new job, they make enough money, they can afford the housing, maybe it's less expensive housing, whatever, and compare them to somebody who's, basically in the same financial position but doesn't have an eviction record. Now do the comparison. That would be a proper way of testing whether an eviction record actually predicts an increased likelihood of a future eviction, but there hasn't been any study done that controls for this present ability to pay. So therefore, we really don't have any reliable evidence to say whether eviction records have any predictive value at all. And I think this is really important uh, sort of way to think about is these tenant screening models. This looks at TransUnion again. They calculate a rental score. So this is sort of like it's not a credit score, but it's the idea is like how likely someone is to fulfill the terms of a lease. And it's sort of like an SAT score. It's like you have between like a 300 and 800 is the maximum. And what they do is they break down the scores into these different bands. So if you have 720 or above, you're in the best score band. And if you've got between 680 and 719, you're in the second best, and so on. And then what they do is they show if you're in a particular score band, like what is your likelihood of defaulting on a lease. And I mean, I don't even know if to what extent these percentages are valid or have any accuracy, but just assuming that they are. What TransUnion says is that if you've got a 720 or above as your rental score, then you've only got a 0.09% chance of defaulting on your lease. I mean, that's infinitesimal, right? Like, pretty much any landlord is going to sign up for that. Like, there's almost, no chance. It's like, your odds are probably better of like winning the lottery or something. Well, if you've got a score in the next band down, you're between 680 and 719. Now you've got a 0.36% chance of defaulting on your lease. So there's two ways of looking at that, right? It's like one way is that's still a vanishingly small percentage, right? I mean, it's not as good as 0.09, but that's still, well over 99% chance that you're going to comply with the lease. But at the same time, it's 4 times higher than if you got the best score. So even if we look at the worst score band below 520, well, 28.79% chance, according to TransUnion, that you're going to default on your lease. I mean, that seems like a pretty high possibility, but it's still, three quarters, 3 out of 4 tenants, more than 3 out of 4 tenants with that score are going to comply with their lease. So I think, maybe the way to look at some of this information is to say, okay, well, as sort of a first pass, do I have a red flag here? I mean, if the person has, 0.09 or 0.36 or 1.53, if they've got one of these really low percentages of likelihoods of default, maybe you just admit them. But even if they have the low score, does that, really mean they should be rejected? They've got, 3 and 4 chance of complying with their lease. In my opinion, maybe not. What you should do is come back and, okay, we've got a red flag here. This shows that you've got a pretty high percentage likelihood of defaulting in your lease. Why should we rent? What makes it more likely that you're among the 3 out of 4 tenants who's going to comply despite this low score versus, you're part of the 1 in 4 who are not going to comply. And that's when the person can say, okay, yeah, well, the reason I had trouble paying before was because, I lost a job, or I had this health issue, or I was renting somewhere with other people and somebody moved out in the middle of the night and we were stuck with whatever it is. Give the person a chance to explain, consider the circumstances. So, I think that's kind of what we're trying to get to in sort of the tenant screening world is using this data and information as sort of a first pass, but allowing for human judgment and consideration of circumstances that don't fit neatly into these types of computer models. HUD in 2022 and again in 2024 issued guidances around these things, you know, basically pointing out some of the circumstances that you should consider when you're looking at things, not only criminal records, which they first pointed out in 2016, but also things like eviction records, credit, look at things like the accuracy, the nature, the relevance, the recency of all this negative information, and make an informed, judgment based on the totality of circumstances and not just using these automatic you're in or you're out type processes. But I think one of the main impetus that HUD needed to do that is because what we generally do see are these rigid up and down scoring type models, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but by and large, I think a lot of landlords and property management companies, they don't want to invest the time and the resources to train their staff to make these kind of reasoned, case by case judgments. They just want to have a computer do it. It's faster, it's more efficient, it's cheaper. They can have anybody, look at a computer screen and say whether it's a green flag or a red flag. They don't have to, have the right person with the right training to make those kinds of decisions. And second, I think this is a myth that the screening company has really gotten a lot of landlords and housing providers to buy into, is this idea that, well, if we just have the computer decide on the person, then we can't be sued for discrimination because we're not making any kind of decision based on the person's race or gender or national origin or any of that stuff. We're just doing whatever the computer says, and this all this objective process. I mean, what we'll see, I think, in a minute is that all that winds up happening is these computer algorithms kind of bake in a lot of bias that's sort of embedded in the data, and it winds up having even worse discriminatory effects. And so that's kind of a myth. Where does this information come from? This is a graphic from the CFPB. You'll see that it just comes from all sorts of public and private databases, banks, licensing entities, law enforcement agencies, courts. And once information sort of gets into this ecosystem, it's hard to get it back out. But tenant screening company computers are linked to that whole network, and they will pull this data. They have algorithms and processes to sort of machine read the contents of a report and crunch it into scores and rental recommendations. How does it do that? This is one sort of indication of how these algorithms work. So you'll see when a landlord signs up with a screening company, they'll get an interface that might look kind of like this. They're all different, but landlords will be asked to basically enter in a set of objective rental criteria, and they have to choose from what the screening company makes available. So you'll see here they can enter information about income to rent ratios and how much income the person is going to have left over after they pay their rent and any debt service they have. It's got information about eviction records, criminal history. The criminal history here, it's pretty sparse. I mean, they can basically choose between misdemeanors and felonies, and then how many, like more than one crime, or more than two. And then is it going to be pass fail? Is it going to be something that might downgrade your application but not automatically deny you? But landlord is going to use sort of these menus and check boxes and so forth to put in the criteria they want, and then the computer system is going to basically tell the landlord whether the person qualified and should be admitted, denied, and or if they didn't qualify, they should be denied. And then a lot of times you'll see a third category, which is where the person might pass the background, the criminal history and behavioral type issues, and they'll say, okay, you're not denied for that, but you don't have good enough credit, so you need a cosigner, or we're going to charge you a higher security deposit. So that's often called an acceptance with conditions, or a conditional acceptance. One of the other issues when landlords are using these types of systems and basically offloading the analysis and the decision to these screening companies instead of doing it themselves, is that it makes it very difficult to figure out if you got denied, what the reason was for that. And so, if there was some kind of error or something that you could respond to, well, it's difficult to figure out what that error was, or what kind of information would potentially change the landlord's mind. Here's another example of one of these decision worksheets that landlords fill out. You see this one. This is only the first page. This is, I think, a 5 or 6 page, maybe even be longer than that, document, which is list all the different crime categories that the screening company has available. And you'll see it's the grid where along the x-axis there's 4 different severity codes. So it's like a felony conviction is the most severe, and then there's other felony charges. So this would be like you're arrested and charged with a felony, but you're not convicted of it. And then there's other convictions. So usually going to be misdemeanors. Some states have like other categories of crimes that are below misdemeanor, but then there's other criminal charges, usually a misdemeanor charge where it's not a conviction. I've never actually understood, like, is having a misdemeanor conviction, is that worse than having a felony charge? I don't think they really get into that, but landlords are supposed to decide. But then a landlord has to put a number in each one of these boxes. Down the y-axis, it's just a list of different crime categories, and say, okay, so for assault-related offenses, how far back do you want to deny people based on these different severity levels? So 99 years for felony convictions. So that's basically ever. Any kind of felony or assault ever, you're out. Other felony charge, 7 years. So landlord puts in 7. So even if you're not convicted, if you're charged with a felony, you're denied for 7 years. And then if it's a misdemeanor conviction, 5 years. So I guess this landlord thinks that having a felony charge is worse than having a misdemeanor conviction, and so forth. But the landlord goes through all these boxes and puts in all these numbers. Um, and then the computer is basically going to look at the criminal record and then try to sort it into a crime category, and sort it into what the severity level is, and then determine how old the criminal record is, and then that spits out a result. Well, the problem is when you request a copy of your criminal history, you don't see a grid that looks anything like that. So you don't know like what crime category they put it in. You don't know what severity code they applied. You don't know like what date they used or how many years old they figured it was, and you don't even actually know like what the different available categories are, or how this computer used those systems. All you get is, well, these are criminal records we found. We found this record with associated with it, but you don't know like how the computer sorted that information. So there may have been a mistake made. It may have put your crime in the wrong category, or it may have used the wrong severity code, or it may have applied the date of. I had a case once where somebody was making payments on an old criminal fine from years ago, and they used the date of the most recent payment on the fine rather than the date that the person was actually convicted of the crime. And like sometimes they don't have all the dates. So there's an with a criminal offense, you've got the date of the offense itself, the date of the arrest, the date of the charge. There's a date the person's convicted. There's a date that they're released from confinement. Which date are you using, right? Because you could have two people that they go and do the same crime together, and one of them pleads guilty, and the other one goes to trial, and so one of them's going to have a conviction date that's much more accelerated, and so forth. And so, like, what date they start, can make a big difference, and you don't get to see any of this type of information. So when the CFPB says that using these algorithms obfuscates the reasoning, and so forth, that's what they're talking about. Is you don't really, you get the basic information. Okay, they denied me from my criminal history, but you don't know like which crime, and how did they filter it, and how did they classify it, and so forth. And that makes it very difficult to figure out whether your application was denied correctly according to their own system, and to dispute anything. And what we're seeing now really in the industry is that these algorithmic models and AI-driven screening systems are becoming even more inscrutable. So this is an article about a product from one of the bigger screening companies called RealPage, which says it's going to predict your willingness to pay rent. So they're not just looking at whether you have the means, and whether you've paid in the past, but they're going to look at like whether you have the will, so assess your, like, I guess, type of person that might have the money and just decide, you know what, I just don't feel like paying my rent. I don't know how many tenants like that there are walking around, but that's what they claim to do, and I have no idea like how a computer is supposed to adjudicate that and how you would respond. So it's sort of this black box dynamic. What information you do get if you've been screened and you want to see what happened with your application, um, there's a statute called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. It's a federal statute from 1970. So it's a pretty antiquated law. I mean, it talks about manila folders, and you're going to go down and get your report out of a file cabinet and look at it in person. Like that's just not the way that this industry operates, anymore, if it ever did. Um, but it gives you the right to see basically all the information in your file. It doesn't necessarily give you the right to see some of these algorithmic readouts and so forth. That's kind of a point of contention that is sort of being fought out in the courts and in the federal agencies. But suffice it to say, it's difficult for everyday people to get that kind of information when they need it to dispute denial. Um, so if you're denied housing, you get an adverse action notice, which is just something telling you that a screening report was used, that you've been denied, and here's where you can get a copy of the screening report. It doesn't give you, any information about the actual reason for denial. This is basically what it looks like. You'll see across the middle here, it has the name of the screening company and their address and phone number. So the idea is you're going to be able to call them. They send you the report, and then you're going to be able to find any mistakes and so forth and dispute it. But as we've seen, a lot of times, even if you get the report, that's not going to be good enough to really detect any kind of mistakes. And usually the person who's applying for housing, they're dealing with somebody that works for the property management company or somebody that works for the landlord. They're not part of the screening company. All they usually see is the ultimate decision, the yes or no, the score, the red flag. They may not even have any insight at all into why the person was denied, or if they do, it may be very superficial. They may just know, well, it was denied for criminal, but I don't know what crime. I don't know whether it was these two convictions or this arrest you have, or um, you know, uh, really any of that. Even if that person, was willing to listen to the applicant, any information they might provide in response or whatever. A lot of times they don't really have the ability to change the result. Often these, especially at the bigger corporate companies, they may have like these integrated software platforms. So if you don't get a green flag on your screening report, then the leasing agent doesn't have the ability to open an account for you and print out a lease and go through the other steps to actually go through the rental process. So you're sort of steered back to the screening company. And then when you call the screening company, they'll say, well, we don't actually know why the landlord denied you. We just provide a recommendation, and they can follow it or not. Um, and the sort of process here is it kind of cools people out is they get the runaround. The leasing agent can't tell them why they're denied. The screening company can't tell them why they're denied. They keep being referred, one refers back to the other. And the idea is most people are just going to get frustrated and give up and go apply somewhere else. Um, so, people are in that situation, refer them to legal aid or to other lawyers who handle these types of matters, because there's often, things that can be done to help them. But a lot of times people don't think of this as necessarily a legal issue. Um, Problems with incorrect information on people's reports is far and away the leading cause of complaints to the CFPB. Just some of the different things that can go wrong, on these reports are, things, what is called a mixed file, or one person's information being confused with somebody else's. That happens all the time, especially with things like eviction records. Because when you think about an eviction record, it's a landlord has the name of the tenant, and they file usually in either a municipal level or a county level court. And there's not going to be the types of personal identifiers in that case file that you would normally see with other types of records. So there's not going to be a social security number. There's not going to be date of birth. There's not going to be other types of unique identifiers. There's usually going to be a name and a location. So name and county, name and city, name. And when screening companies are trying to match eviction records to people, and all they have to go on is somebody's name and county or name and city, it's very easy to assign your eviction record to someone else. Another really common accuracy issue with these records is a lot of times it doesn't report the outcome of a case. So if you have a criminal record where there's an arrest, um, and maybe that's never updated to show that the charges were dismissed, or you have a criminal record showing there was a felony charge and the person later pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor. A lot of times that's not updated, and looks like the person still has this pending felony arrest. Or sometimes you get like the law enforcement computer will put it in as a felony arrest, and then it's the court computer that shows that the person pleaded guilty to the misdemeanor, and it shows up twice. It makes it look like they have two crimes and not just one. Um, so lots of different types of problems, and this can create issues for people, even if they may not necessarily have been denied because of the incorrect record, but it impedes them from being able to necessarily go back and challenge something. So this is an example from a real case, and I changed the names, but this person had an uncle with basically the same name that had a different spelling. But his uncle's criminal records were matched uh, to him. And I mean, if you look at what his screening report is, it's a pretty bad rap sheet. I mean, he's got multiple crimes. He's got an assault. He's got VUXA. That's a violation of the Uniform Controlled Substances Act. So that's basically a drug offense. He's got burglary and then criminal trespass on top of that. Well, what actually his record should have shown, first of all, is that the first two crimes belong to his uncle, so those shouldn't have even been on there. It's just that they were matched because they have the same name, and his computers are set up so that, like, if your name is John, it's going to match you to any spelling of John. So whether that's John or Jon or Jonn or whatever, just because it's not the same spelling, it's still going to be on there. It will also usually match first and middle names as if they're the same. So especially if you've got a common name, there's a really good chance you're going to have other people's criminal history showing up on your background check. Next, he's one of these people that had been arrested and charged with a more significant offense and then pleaded guilty to a lesser offense. So he was arrested and charged for burglary. 3 months later, he pleaded guilty to criminal trespass. So he really should have just had this one offense. And would he have still gotten in with a fairly recent criminal trespass conviction? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But it's a lot easier to get in with just that than with this whole rap sheet. So you can see the kind of role that these errors play. And then just the last thing I'll mention is that these types of screening methods have very significant discriminatory impacts on African American groups especially, but also other protected classes, including Latinos. You'll see there's large disparities in the rate of incarceration and criminal justice involvement for Black and Latino men especially. And then, of course, once you acquire a criminal record, a lot of times, that record becomes the basis for people to be denied housing as well as other, employment and so forth. And of course, this has really been a product of mass incarceration, which was intentional policy that sort of started in the wake of Jim Crow to sort of continue a lot of those policies. So, that's why HUD put out guidance in 2016. The current administration has withdrawn this for no specific, they haven't really given a reason, but I think it's pretty clear they just disagree with civil rights. But basically in 2016, HUD said, okay, look, if you're going to use criminal history to make decisions on housing, you got to follow some basic rules here. First of all, none of this just blanket bans on nobody with any kind of criminal history whatsoever. Second, if you're going to use criminal history against somebody, you got to use convictions. You shouldn't be relying on just arrest records, or situations where there's just not enough evidence to show the person actually did the crime. And then third, you got to make an individualized review available. So before you go and deny the person, give them a chance to explain the circumstances, show evidence of rehabilitation, or other mitigating information that might suggest that you should rent them anyway. That's kind of been the blueprint for how other types of negative rental screening information should be treated. We see similar types of disparities with eviction records. Um, that, black tenants, especially black female tenants, far and away have the highest rates of eviction as compared with other groups. And a lot of landlords still will just deny admission for any filed eviction case. So it doesn't matter if the case was dismissed. It doesn't matter if the case was filed in retaliation because the tenant requested repairs or called the health department or something like that. Um, Furthermore, most eviction cases are settled. So, kind of like using records of arrest where there's no conviction, using a record of a filed eviction case where the court hasn't made any findings that the tenant actually defaulted in rent or violated the lease. That's kind of the norm. Landlords will just use those records anyway and assume, well, if the landlord filed a case, then the tenant must have done something to deserve it. And then, especially with eviction records, there's sort of a secondary sort of chilling effect on this because tenants understand that, hey, if I get sued for eviction, that's going to impair me when I go try and apply for housing in the future. And especially if you're living in housing that is in great condition or you've got a damaged relationship with the landlord already, you may not be looking to live there for the rest of your life. And if you've got the choice, then well, I can ask for these repairs, or I can object to this illegal rent increase, or whatever is going on. I can assert my rights as a tenant. But if I do that, my landlord's going to sue me for eviction, and the case might be dismissed, but I'm still going to have a record of being sued. You know what? It's not worth it. I'm just going to move out, or I'm just going to pay the illegal rent increase, or I'm not going to request the repairs. So it really has a kind of a chilling effect on tenants to be able to actually exercise the protections that they do. So um, uh, again, HUD's recommending that landlords not use these sort of automatic denial purposes, but sort of look more at the full circumstances. We see similar disparities with credit scores. Um, Last, I think a really overlooked issue in this area is rental application fees. I mentioned at the outset. The problem with rental application fees isn't usually, the one-time fee. I mean, if you're applying for housing and it might be, 1,500 a month, 1,800 a month, $2,000 a month, for the property that you're looking to rent, well, paying a $35 fee or $70 fee or $100 fee even at the outset, in the context of that kind of transaction, it's pretty insignificant. But when you have to pay that fee just to apply and you don't get in and the money's non-refundable, and that means you got to pay over again to apply somewhere else, that becomes a different deal because now you've got people that are going to be deterred from applying where they want to live because they think I might not get in. And we've got some data from Zillow, which shows that Black and Latinx renters are about twice as likely as white and Asian American renters to have to submit 5 or more rental applications in a housing search. So, those are the people that this really hurts, right? Is because, if you just have to pay that fee one time or maybe twice to apply somewhere and then you get housing, not that big a deal. But when you get denied repeatedly and, you've been paying these fees over and over, well, now it's like, okay, I'm probably going to steer myself toward the less, lower quality housing and in the parts of town that maybe don't have the same quality schools and the same kind of job opportunities and so forth, because that's where I'm more likely to get in. And so you can see like, this having a real potential to drive, residential segregation. So I think this is a really important issue that hasn't really gotten the attention it deserves. But that's really all that I had uh, for my slides. Happy to have questions if people have them.
I was going to say, and if individuals have questions and they want to talk, please raise your hand or let me know, and I can allow you to talk, or you can use the Q&A box. No questions? Let's try to get at least two. All right, Margaret. Ooh, Margaret, are you there? Would you like to talk? Okay.
I have a question in general, and it's Peggy. I have a question in general about these application fees. Are they are they really justifiable on any level for them not to be refunded if they do
Uh,
not accept if they do not accept the individual? I mean, this sounds like an impossible thing to be happening from the beginning for people to find housing.
well, I think that's a great
They-
question. I actually wrote a article about this issue for the Georgetown Journal on Poverty Law and Policy a couple of years ago. And, what I looked at is, first of all, the justification that landlords usually give for these fees is that it pays the cost of the screening report, which, first of all, it just turns out to be factually untrue in the large majority of instances. Most landlords will have a kind of a subscription to a company, and they'll pay just by the month to just get as many reports as they need. And the actual per report fee that they're charging is more than what they pay in the subscription model. So that's just not even true usually. A lot of times nowadays landlords are adding additional processing fees. So they charge like an application fee, and then there's also a processing fee to look at your application, which is you know just sort of piling on. Um, but there's some interesting things that I look at is, for example, most states prohibit illegal lotteries. And a lottery is defined as basically as basically collecting money for a chance at a prize that's randomly determined from a group of people. So you can have like the state giving out exceptions to we can have like a state lottery or something. But generally that's a form of gambling, and it is prohibited. And when you look at, how some of these rental application fees go, we've seen landlords that will collect a large number of applications for one vacancy. Um, and then, how they actually determine who they're renting to is either, they're going to kind of size people up and run the person's application that they like the most first, or they're going to just, do like a random selection. And so I think, an argument that some of these are actually illegal lotteries. I think it really, it's very reminiscent of gambling when you really look at it, because it's sort of you're betting that you're going to get into this housing. You don't really know what the criteria are going to be accepted or not. You're just you put down your application fee and hope for the best. Um, so I would agree. And then I think, critically is that the applicant doesn't get anything out of the background check. The benefit goes entirely to the landlord, right? The applicant, they want the housing. They don't need to be screened. Like
Mhm.
it's if somebody wants to do screening, the landlord benefits from that. So it seems only fair that the landlord ought to be the one that pays for it, especially when, the person winds up not getting the housing. So they really have
More
nothing to
than I
show
can
for
you
the
get a
money.
copy of the sign, some interesting things that is fine. This is basic.
I'm sorry. I could, is there another question from someone?
Yeah, I do believe Andy Anderson. Did you have a question? If not, we had a few in the chat. So, um, I would say the one, Elias, he is wondering, is there any recommended action? So
Yes.
basically, what can we do here
Mhm.
to kind of like help remedy some of these issues in tenant screening? And then furthermore, like maybe geared towards like landlords, like what could we do to encourage landlords to participate in the solution as well?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a number of things, and I mean, with the time we have, I couldn't really go comprehensively through all of it, but I kind of break the solutions up into a few different buckets. So, um, One that I think is some of the more lower hanging fruit are just some of the procedural protections. So things like, although the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act provides for a very sparse adverse action notice, it doesn't really give you much, if any, information about why you were turned down. States can have their own adverse action notice requirements. So just requiring the landlord to just put in writing, if they turn down your application, what the reasons were, can go a long way, because that way, if you were denied for a reason that was, um, you know, against the law or contrary to landlord's own policy, you can hold them to that. So it doesn't become kind of this moving target of like the leasing agent says, oh, it looks like you were denied for criminal history. And then you go back and show that the criminal record on your report was actually belonged to somebody else and you don't have any criminal history. And oh, it wasn't that, it was your credit. No. So, it sort of made up their mind and then dug in their heels. So that can be an important thing. Of course, different types of restrictions on application fees, I think it goes a long way. So I think the best thing a state could do is just prohibit them, put the cost on landlords. But if you can't get, the political will for that, then, refund for people who are denied is something to explore. Sometimes just looking at like capping them at a nominal fee, so like $5 or something. A lot of states have prohibited landlords from charging more than they have to pay to get the report, which sounds good, but one problem is tenants don't really have any insight into how much the landlords are actually paying. Second is that the real problem isn't the one time, isn't the fee. It's the people that have to pay over and over again. So even if they only have to pay the $35 or $50 or whatever the landlord says they're paying for the report, if they got to pay that over and over again, that type of protection doesn't really do much to help. So those are a couple of the sort of procedural reforms that I think, go a long way to, reducing these problems. And then looking at just some of the specific criteria. So, having an eviction record sealing law or having restrictions on what types of eviction history that landlords can use against an applicant. So, no denials based on dismissed cases, for example, having some kind of time limit, 2 years, 3 years, no denying people for eviction records that are more than, 3 years old, 2 years old, that sort of a thing. Similar types of limits on the use of criminal history. I think, those are kind of the main reforms that would make the most difference in this space. And then, from a standpoint of like landlords, what they can do kind of on their own. And I think landlords are ultimately going to have to do this anyway in order to comply with the fair housing laws, is develop some kind of an appeal procedure, have some kind of process available that people can use if they're denied to come back and say, okay, well, here's here's the mitigating circumstances evidence I have, or here's why, even though I had an eviction 2 years ago, I can afford the rent now. Have some type of procedure that people can avail themselves of so that you are doing the individualized review. Because, if landlords aren't doing that, I mean, they're already at peril of potentially being sued for, disparate impact liability for a lot of these types of screening.
Then Brittany, I want to make sure we have time to squeeze in your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so my question is around the holding fees and if those are refundable. So are the holding fees refundable? And if so, are tenants aware of this? And are they aware of their timeline of how long they have to request that holding fee back?
So that's going to be a matter of state law. So I think you're talking about the types of fees or deposits that a landlord will, like if somebody wants to rent a unit, but they need time to make up their mind or something, the landlord will keep the unit off the market for a certain amount of time, and they may take a fee for that. And then if the tenant doesn't, I guess, move into the unit or sign the lease within a certain amount of time or something, then the landlord keeps the money. I really can't say because I'm not a Utah lawyer and I don't know what Utah law provides on that, and that's entirely an issue of state landlord-tenant law. So afraid I'm gonna have to punt on that question. Sorry.
Okay. No, thank you.
And then, Eric, we had quite a few people wondering if we could get a copy of those slides. I know we recorded this session, but would it be okay to say that we can send a copy of the slides as well?
Yeah, that's fine.
All righty. Well, if that is it, I just want to say thank you, Eric. If we could all in the chat, just give him kind of like a round of applause. We really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with us today. And I think we had some pretty engaging questions at the end. Um, and yeah, we're very excited to kind of tackle this here in Utah. I heard Eric on a separate Zoom in regards to like tenant screening and all of that, and I thought it was very impressive. And so I think you gave us a lot today to think about, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, and best of luck as things move forward. Thanks for having me. Take care.
All right, thank you everybody for joining.